It was just an ordinary afternoon at the airport. Travelers bustled through the terminal, dragging suitcases and clutching coffee cups, eager to reach their destinations. Among them was Marcus Reed, a decorated black surgeon fresh from a medical conference. His return flight home marked the end of a long week of lectures and late nights spent refining his research. Marcus was no stranger to airports. He had traveled countless times for work, always navigating the space with quiet confidence. But today, as he approached the first-class boarding lane, the air felt different. A flight attendant glanced at his ticket, her eyes narrowing slightly as they flickered to his face. "Sir," she began, hesitating just a moment too long. "I think you may be in the wrong line." Marcus smiled politely, holding up his pass. "Seat 3A, first class." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "One moment, please." The next 7 minutes unraveled faster than Marcus could have imagined. A supervisor appeared, then another. Words like confusion and mistake floated around him, though no one said them directly to his face. He stood still, calm, as passengers behind him began to stare. Finally, the gate agent returned, avoiding eye contact as she printed a new boarding pass. "We've reassigned you to seat 28C, she said, sliding the ticket toward him. "Economy." Marcus paused, his heart tightening. "I paid for the first class." "I'm sorry, sir. We overbooked." But as Marcus stepped aside, watching others, none who looked like him, board first class without incident, he realized this was no overbooking. 40 minutes into the flight, just as Marcus settled into his cramped economy seat, an urgent announcement crackled over the speakers. "If there is a doctor on board, please make yourself known to the cabin crew immediately." Marcus's instincts took over. He pressed the call button. A flustered flight attendant appeared at his row. Recognizing him instantly, her cheeks flushed as she stammered. "Dr. Reed, we need you in first class. The captain is unwell." Marcus followed her without a word. In the front cabin, he found the pilot slumped over, his breathing shallow. Passengers watched with wide eyes as Marcus worked swiftly, stabilizing the man with limited medical equipment. By the time they landed, Marcus had saved the captain's life. As paramedics wheeled the pilot away, the same supervisor who had downgraded Marcus earlier approached him. Her expression was strained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Reed, thank you, and I'm deeply sorry for what happened before." Marcus met her gaze, his own steady and calm. "You knew exactly who I was before," he replied. "You just didn't think I belonged here." The video of Marcus saving the pilot went viral within hours. But it wasn't the headlines that mattered to him. It was a reminder to himself and to everyone else that no one needed permission to occupy the space they had already earned. The airport smelled of burnt coffee and hurried lives. Dr. Elijah Grant walked through the terminal with the ease of a man accustomed to navigating spaces that were not made with him in mind. He moved without urgency, his shoulders squared beneath the tailored weight of a navy blue blazer. At 50, Elijah had long understood that dignity wasn't something you carried. It was something you wore, stitched carefully into the fabric of every choice. Tonight, he was flying first class to Los Angeles. Not for work, but to rest. To finally accept that rarest of gifts, stillness. But even as he approached the gate, Elijah felt the undercurrent. It was subtle, as racism often is. A brief pause from the flight attendant as she scanned his boarding pass. A slight narrowing of her eyes as she read his name. "Dr. Grant," she repeated, as if tasting the title, trying to find the flaw. Elijah nodded once, watching her carefully. "Right this way," she said, her voice bright with the kind of politeness that concealed questions. The first-class cabin was half full, a quiet hum of briefcases and hushed conversations. Elijah settled into seat 2A by the window, stretching his legs beneath the broad leather space. He exhaled, letting the tension slide from his shoulders, and pulled out a book, James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son. It had been years since he read it, but tonight felt like a good time to remember. He hadn't made it past the first chapter before it began. A shadow fell across his lap. Elijah looked up. "Sir," the flight attendant said, her smile thin. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Elijah didn't sigh. He had learned not to. He handed it over, watching as she scanned it twice, once for verification, and again for the possibility of error. Her eyes flickered, lips tightening. "I'll just check with my supervisor," she said. And there it was. The supervisor arrived moments later. A tall man named Robert whose tie was just slightly askew. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who believed himself to be right, even when he wasn't. "Dr. Grant," Robert began, "there seems to be an issue with your seat assignment." Elijah folded his book. "What kind of issue? We don't have a record of your reservation here in first class." Elijah leaned back slightly, crossing his legs. "I booked this flight 6 weeks ago. I can show you the confirmation." Robert hesitated. "That won't be necessary," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "I'm afraid we'll need to move you to the economy until we sort this out." There it was. The suggestion wrapped in silk. Elijah didn't move. Not yet. Because the thing about racism is that it rarely announces itself at the door. It seeps in through the cracks, wearing the face of policy, of protocol. "I'll stay right here," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "Sort it out from here." Robert's jaw tightened. "Sir, if you refuse to comply, we'll have to ask you to leave the plane." Elijah's grip on the book firmed. There was something almost poetic about being escorted off a plane while holding Baldwin in hand. But not tonight. Elijah rose with deliberate care, retrieving his coat from the overhead compartment. Because sometimes, survival wasn't about the fight. It was about knowing when to leave the battlefield. And how to return. As he followed Robert toward the back of the plane, Elijah could feel the eyes trailing behind him. Some were curious. Others held the heavy silence of complicity. A young black woman in row 12 caught his gaze as he passed. She didn't say anything, but her nod was loud enough. "I see you." Elijah nodded back. "Yes." But the story wasn't over. Elijah Grant sat stiffly in seat 22C, his shoulders brushing the narrow arms of economy class. He folded his coat over his lap, smoothing it out with care. As if the simple act of preserving its shape might reclaim some small measure of dignity. The book, still in his hand, felt heavier now. Across the aisle, a young man in a hoodie bobbed his head to music no one else could hear. 2 rows ahead, an elderly couple whispered softly to one another, their eyes flickering in his direction before drifting away. No one said anything, but Elijah knew how silence worked. It built itself like scaffolding. One glance at a time, one averted gaze layered over another, until doubt became structural. Something solid enough to lean against. He had seen this architecture before. In hospitals, in boardrooms, in classrooms where he had once been the only black student seated in the front row. Tonight, it had taken the form of a man named Robert, whose footsteps he could still hear pacing the aisle. Somewhere in the distance, the flight crew welcomed first-class passengers with champagne. Elijah heard the subtle clink of glasses, the soft rustle of newspapers being folded. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the thin cushion. This wasn't the first time he had been displaced. And yet, despite the repetition of it, the sting never dulled. It wasn't about the seat. It was about what the seat symbolized. The quiet reminder that even after 30 years of saving lives, he could still be treated like a trespasser in places he had paid to enter. He thought of his father, a machinist, a man who had once told him, "They'll always remind you who they think you are. Your job is to remind them who you actually are." But Elijah was tired of reminding. Tired of carrying his credentials like a shield. Weary from the weight of having to explain himself before he was allowed to belong. A tap on his shoulder pulled him from his thoughts. "Excuse me," the woman next to him said quietly, shifting slightly in her seat. "I couldn't help but notice." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I saw what happened," she continued. "That wasn't right." Elijah studied her face, a stranger in her early 60s. Hair swept back in a neat bun. Eyes soft but searching. He nodded once, unsure of what to say. She didn't press him. Instead, she offered something he hadn't expected. "Would you like the aisle seat?" she asked, gesturing toward the open spot beside her. "Might give you a little more room." It wasn't much, But Elijah recognized the gesture for what it was. One piece of scaffolding dismantled. "I appreciate that," he said, switching seats. They sat side by side in silence. But it was a different kind of quiet now. As the plane taxied to the runway, Elijah caught sight of Robert, standing near the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Robert looked away. Elijah opened his book again, turning to the page he had left behind. The battle wasn't over, but he was exactly where he needed to be. The plane sliced through the night sky, leaving behind the shimmering coastline and the city lights that blurred into a quiet hum beneath them. Elijah Grant kept his eyes fixed on the cabin ceiling, watching the soft glow of overhead lights flicker faintly as if uncertain of their own purpose. The woman beside him had long since drifted into sleep, her hands gently folded across her lap. Across the aisle, the young man in the hoodie was nodding off, his music still faintly audible through the cheap tangle of earbuds. Elijah remained awake. Sleep didn't come easily on nights like this. Not after displacement. Not after humiliation carefully wrapped in the soft language of policy and procedure. He shifted, stretching his legs in the limited space between rows. The narrowness of the seat pressed against his knees, and the edges of his coat brushed against the worn fabric of the armrest. Up front, behind the velvet curtain of first class, the soft murmur of conversation drifted back. An exclusive symphony of privilege that he could no longer access. It wasn't the champagne or reclining seats that weighed on Elijah. It was the knowledge that the value of his presence, the worth of his existence, seemed negotiable depending on who was asking the questions. He remembered the early days, those fragile years when his white colleagues called him Dr. Grant, with just the faintest trace of hesitation. As if the weight of the title sat too heavily on his black skin. He remembered the double takes in hospital hallways, the patients who asked to see someone else, the supervisors who suggested he explain his qualifications before rounds. And yet, despite it all, Elijah had learned to work within the boundaries that others imposed. That was the unspoken agreement. You can succeed. So long as you don't remind anyone how much harder it was for you to get here. The intercom crackled softly, pulling Elijah from his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice echoed, low and steady. "We're expecting light turbulence over the Rockies. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A faint murmur followed as passengers adjusted trays and returned upright. Elijah fastened his belt and glanced toward the front of the plane. Through the small gap in the curtain, he caught sight of Robert standing by the galley, speaking quietly to another crew member. The glance wasn't intentional, just the passing gaze of someone who had long since learned to observe without intrusion. But Robert noticed. His eyes met Elijah's briefly before he shifted away, disappearing behind the wall of first class. Doors close quietly in places you were never meant to enter. As the plane rocked gently, Elijah returned to his book. Baldwin's words met him like old friends. But tonight, they felt heavier, etched deeper into the quiet space between memory and experience. The most dangerous creation of any society is the man who has nothing to lose. Elijah turned the page. He wasn't sure if he had something to lose or if he had already lost it. Piece by piece, in moments like these. But the battle was no longer about his seat. It was about every small humiliation that came dressed as professionalism. Every question disguised as curiosity. The plane steadied, gliding smoothly over the distant mountains. Elijah let the rhythm of flight settle into him. But he knew the turbulence wasn't over. Not really. It never was. The soft hum of the aircraft felt heavier now, like the quiet before a storm one could sense but not yet see. Elijah Grant turned another page in his book, though his eyes no longer followed the words. The turbulence outside mirrored something closer, something pressing just beneath the skin. Tight as a drum. In first class, the curtain shifted slightly as Robert stepped out, his gaze sweeping the cabin like a watchman unsure of who might trespass next. His eyes flicked past Elijah and stopped 2 rows ahead, settling on the young man in the hoodie. Robert's posture stiffened. Elijah didn't need to hear the conversation. He had witnessed this scene before, a different flight, a different city, but the lines never changed. It was the slow narrowing of suspicion, The way some were seen as harmless while others had to prove their innocence by the mere act of sitting still. The young man pulled out his boarding pass, flashing it with a slight shrug as if he too had learned that resistance could often cost more than compliance. Robert examined it longer than necessary, then walked away without another word. Elijah felt the tension coil in his chest. But he remained silent. Pick your battles. That's what his father used to say. But Elijah couldn't shake the question. When do you finally get to win the war? An hour later, the plane hit another patch of turbulence, rattling the overhead compartments. A flight attendant's voice floated through the intercom, reminding passengers to remain seated. A woman across the aisle flinched as the plane dipped slightly, her hand gripping the armrest until her knuckles whitened. Elijah offered a calm glance, the kind meant to reassure without speaking. Do you fly often? She asked, her voice tight but polite. Often enough, Elijah replied. It's nothing to worry about. Just air moving like water. She nodded, exhaling softly. For a moment, they sat in mutual silence. But Elijah felt the shift before she said it. The slight hesitation that always preceded the question. Doctor, you said? She asked carefully. Elijah nodded. What kind of doctor, if you don't mind me asking? Neurosurgeon. Her eyebrows lifted, surprise flashing across her face before she quickly smoothed it away. Impressive, she said. I suppose people must look at you and assume, well, you know how people can be. Elijah smiled faintly, though the weight of her words pressed on him like an old coat he thought he had discarded years ago. Yes, he said simply. I know exactly how people can be. The curtain to first class shifted again. Robert reappeared, carrying a tray of drinks he distributed with delicate precision. But something had shifted in his eyes. When he passed Elijah's row, their gazes met briefly, just long enough for Robert to offer a nod. A small one. The kind that suggested acknowledgement but not apology. The kind that said, I know who you are now. Elijah met the nod with a steady glance. But he didn't return it. Because that was the weight of it all. The knowledge that even when respect finally arrived, it often came too late, trailing behind the damage it had already done. Elijah's fingers tightened around his book. But he didn't turn the page. Instead, he stared out the window, watching as the clouds stretched endlessly below the wing. Some lines could not be crossed without consequence. But tonight, Elijah decided, he would not be the one retreating. The plane sailed through the night, each minute folding into the next with the steady rhythm of engines and whispered conversations. The cabin lights dimmed, and the world outside the window stretched into a vast darkness that seemed to press against the glass. Elijah Grant sat in the quiet hum of seat 22C. The pages of notes of a native son resting lightly in his lap. But his thoughts no longer held to Baldwin's words. Instead, they drifted back to the curtain. It hadn't moved for some time now. First class had returned to its world of quiet indulgence, champagne, warm towels, the soft rustle of privilege. And Elijah could feel the weight of that separation more acutely than the seatbelt across his chest. It was not the curtain itself that held power. It was an agreement, the silent contract that divided space into those who were meant to be there and those who were tolerated until proven otherwise. And tonight, Elijah had been tolerated. He watched as Robert made his rounds again, pausing briefly by Route 10 to collect empty glasses. His footsteps were softer now, his gaze avoiding Elijah's aisle altogether. It was a strange dance, this avoidance that was not quite an apology. Elijah knew it well. He had seen it in hospitals, in boardrooms, in polite dinner parties where he was both guest and outsider, welcomed but never fully invited. The language of silence had always been part of the architecture. And tonight, Robert was fluent. Elijah's gaze shifted to the young man across the aisle. The one Robert had questioned earlier. He was asleep now, head tilted against the window, earbuds still faintly buzzing with muffled bass. Elijah wondered how many times the boy had been pulled aside. How many boarding passes had been inspected twice just because someone had been trained to see him as a question mark in the wrong place. He wondered if the boy even noticed anymore, or if this was simply the price he had learned to pay without protest. Excuse me, a voice said softly. Elijah looked up to find the older woman beside him awake. adjusting the scarf around her neck. Her eyes, though kind, held the same unspoken curiosity that lingered in places like these. "Doctor," she said, repeating the word as if testing it for weight. "I was thinking, it must be quite something. Your line of work." Elijah offered a small nod. "It has its moments," he replied. Her gaze lingered just a little too long. And Elijah knew what came next before she asked it. "You must be one of the first in your family to, well, to reach that level of success." Elijah smiled faintly, though he felt the edges of exhaustion curling at his ribs. "My father was a machinist," Elijah said, "but my grandfather taught at Howard University for 30 years. The woman blinked, her surprise masked poorly by a polite laugh. "Well," she said, smoothing her skirt, "I suppose these things run deeper than we think." Elijah let her words hang in the air. He had no desire to soften the silence that followed. Somewhere near the front of the cabin, Robert's voice echoed faintly as he addressed another passenger. Elijah did not look up this time. He knew the rhythm by heart now. The careful avoidance. The way respect arrived only after it had been demanded. But there was no comfort in it. Because Elijah knew this wasn't victory. This was survival. And survival had always been the least a man could ask for. Tonight, that was not enough. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, as if the plane had slipped into a space where gravity itself held a quiet grudge. Elijah Grant could feel it in the way Robert moved. How his steps slowed near row 22 but never stopped. How the eyes of the passengers flicked toward Elijah. Then away, careful not to linger too long, as if proximity alone might tether them to something uncomfortable. It wasn't the kind of weight that pressed suddenly. No, this was something slower. It sank into the skin like damp air on an autumn night. Soft but persistent. A reminder that not all burdens announce themselves with fanfare. Some arrive quietly, in the form of questions that are never asked of others. Elijah shifted in his seat, the smallness of it amplifying the silence that seemed to have claimed him. He glanced at his watch. Not because he cared about the time, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. The flight had crossed into the deep stillness of late night, where the world outside was nothing but black sky and scattered lights miles below. But inside, the quiet held its own kind of hum. A few rows ahead, a businessman typed furiously on his laptop, eyes flicking between screens. A woman near the front flipped through a magazine, the pages turning with deliberate slowness. And Robert, Elijah noted, had disappeared behind the curtain once more. It had been over an hour since Elijah was moved from first class. Long enough for the sting to settle, but not long enough for it to fade. He thought of his patients. The ones who arrived in his office with pains they had ignored for months. Sometimes years. Small discomforts. They called them inconveniences. By the time they sat across from him, those discomforts had become something else entirely. It was the same with injustice. A slight, a second glance, a mispronounced name. Nothing, on its own, worth starting a war over. But Elijah knew better. He had learned long ago that small injustices rarely stayed small. They gathered, brick by brick. They built something inside a man until the weight of it became too much to bear quietly. "Would you like anything to drink?" The flight attendant's voice startled him. And Elijah looked up to find a new face standing beside him, someone younger. Softer around the edges, with the tired but genuine smile of a woman who hadn't yet learned to filter her kindness through corporate policy. "I'm fine," Elijah replied, but the words felt too automatic. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, as if unsure whether to say more. I saw what happened earlier," she said softly, leaning in just enough to keep her voice from carrying. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. It shouldn't have happened." Elijah studied her face. The sincerity was real, unpolished by the kind of experience that smoothed over the rough edges of confrontation. "It happens more than you think," Elijah replied gently, offering her a nod of thanks. "But I appreciate it." She smiled faintly, hesitating for another beat before moving down the aisle. And just like that, Elijah felt something shift. The injustice hadn't disappeared. But now, at least, it has been seen. The curtain at the front of the cabin rustled, and Robert emerged once more, moving toward Elijah's row with purpose this time. Elijah set his book aside. bracing for whatever came next. Robert stopped at the aisle, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Grant," he began, voice lower now, quieter. "The captain would like to speak with you." Elijah arched a brow, closing his book with deliberate slowness. "Is there a problem?" Robert hesitated. "No," he said carefully. "But I believe he wants to apologize. Personally." The words hung between them, awkward and unfinished. Elijah glanced toward the curtain, considering the weight of it all. A personal apology. As if the weight of that small gesture could somehow unwrite the hours that had passed. Elijah rose from his seat, nodding for Robert to lead the way. He walked the narrow aisle with the quiet grace of a man who knew exactly what it meant to be summoned but rarely invited. The eyes of the passengers followed, but Elijah kept his head high. The weight of small injustices still clung to him. But tonight, it would not bow his shoulders. Elijah followed Robert up the narrow aisle, feeling the weight of the passengers' gazes like shadows cast along the floor. Some watched openly, while others busied themselves with magazines or pretended to sleep. It wasn't the first time Elijah had walked this walk, shoulders squared, spine straight. Not out of pride, but necessity. He had learned long ago that black men are often judged by how well they carry their own dignity. And tonight, dignity was all he had left. The curtain to first class whispered shut behind them, sealing off the boundary that had drawn itself too easily between Elijah and the world that lay ahead. Robert cleared his throat. "The captain is in the galley," he said, nodding toward the small space just beyond the row of empty champagne flutes. "He wanted to thank you personally." "Thank you." Elijah almost laughed. There was nothing funny about it. But injustice had a way of twisting itself into irony. The apology, Elijah realized, wasn't for him. It was for the crew. For the airline. For the peace of mind that came when absolution could be tucked away neatly, like napkins folded at the end of a meal. The galley was dimmer than the cabin. The overhead lights muted to a soft glow. Captain Reeves stood with his back to Elijah, one hand resting on the counter where a single coffee cup sat, untouched. He was older than Elijah expected. Late 50s, perhaps. His hair had begun to gray. But there was a stillness in his shoulders that reminded Elijah of surgeons. Men who had held too many lives in their hands to waste energy on unnecessary movement. When Reeves turned, his expression was unreadable. "Dr. Grant," the captain began, extending his hand. "I apologize for disturbing you." Elijah shook it, feeling the strength behind Reeves' grip. "No disturbance," Elijah replied calmly, though they both knew better. Reeves held the handshake a second longer than necessary, as if searching for the right words beneath the weight of it. "I heard about the misunderstanding," Reeves said carefully. "Robert filled me in." Elijah said nothing, letting the silence stretch long enough for Reeves to feel it. "I want you to know," Reeves continued, his voice lowering, "that this is not reflective of how we treat our passengers." Elijah arched a brow. "I think it might be exactly reflective," he replied, his tone polite but unflinching. Reeves stiffened slightly, and for a moment, Elijah saw the flicker of discomfort ripple across his face. That was the thing about men like Reeves. They were not accustomed to having their authority questioned. Least of all by the very people their authority had wronged. But Elijah had spent too many years in operating rooms, facing down death itself, to be intimidated by a man in a uniform. "I don't doubt your sincerity, Captain," Elijah added after a pause. "But sincerity doesn't erase the pattern." Reeves exhaled, leaning against the counter. "You're right," he admitted, surprising Elijah. "I won't insult you by pretending this hasn't happened before." Elijah studied him, waiting. "I've been flying for 28 years. Reeves continued. "I've watched this industry change. But not fast enough. And not for everyone." The honesty in Reeves' voice caught Elijah off guard. It was rare, this kind of truth. Rare because it acknowledged the quiet war black men fought every day. The war that wasn't waged with slurs or fists, but with questions like, "Are you sure this is your seat?" Reeves straightened, nodding toward the curtain. "I can offer you your seat back," he said. "I should have done that an hour ago." Elijah smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's not about the seat." Reeves met his gaze, understanding lingering behind his eyes. "I know," he said, But sometimes it's about reminding others that you belong there all along. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. But Elijah's footing held steady. "Thank you," Elijah replied. "But I think I'll stay where I am." Reeves hesitated, then extended his hand once more. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you're on this flight." Elijah clasped it, his grip firm. "I imagine you are," he replied, though there was no malice in his voice, only truth. Because men like Elijah were always necessary, even when the world forgot to leave room for them. The descent began slowly, a soft hum of engines shifting pitch as the plane dipped lower into the thick night air. From his seat, Elijah Grant could see the first scattered lights of the city sprawling below, small flickers cutting through the dark. As if the earth itself had opened its eyes to greet him. Passengers stirred around him, stretching stiff limbs and adjusting headrests. The businessman across the aisle snapped his laptop shut with a satisfied click, while the young man in the hoodie rubbed the sleep from his eyes. Blinking at the cabin's dim light, Elijah felt the shift in the plane's body. The way the weight seemed to pull forward as the wheels inched closer to the runway. But there was another weight too. The kind that didn't dissolve with altitude. Robert reappeared from behind the curtain. His movements quieter now, almost careful. He glanced toward Elijah but did not speak, as if the space between them could only be bridged by what had already been left unsaid. Elijah didn't mind. Some silences held their own lessons. The woman beside him folded her hands neatly in her lap, stealing glances at Elijah as if the apology on her lips wasn't quite ready to be born. Finally, as the plane gave its first gentle shudder in preparation for landing, she spoke. "I hope you didn't take offense," she said softly. "I meant no harm earlier." Elijah turned to her, his gaze steady. "Offense isn't the right word," he replied. She hesitated. "I suppose I just wasn't expecting someone like you to sit here?" Elijah finished for her, though there was no sharpness in his voice. She colored slightly, looking down at her hands. "It's not your fault," Elijah said, leaning back into his seat. "People aren't used to seeing us in certain spaces. And when they do, they assume we've wandered in by mistake." Her eyes flickered with something like shame. But Elijah didn't let her hold it too long. "But that's how change works," he added gently, "one seat at a time." The runway lights stretched into view now, drawing closer with each passing second. The plane dipped lower, slicing through the clouds until the horizon was visible again, a thin silver line against the blackness. Elijah exhaled softly. The landing always felt different from the flight. It was quieter, heavier, as if the sky had allowed him to borrow its freedom. But the ground now demanded its return. Robert passed by once more, pausing briefly at Elijah's row. "Dr. Grant," he said quietly, the stiffness gone from his voice now. "Thank you for your understanding tonight." Elijah looked up at him, holding his gaze for a long moment. "Just do better next time," Elijah replied, his words even but firm. "For the next person who doesn't have the patience to explain why they belong here." Robert nodded. "I will." And Elijah believed him. Because change didn't come with grand gestures or public apologies. It came with the quiet realization that the world would only shift if enough men like Robert chose to shift with it. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the wheels skimming the earth as if reluctant to let go of the sky. As they taxied toward the gate, Elijah felt the tension in the cabin release. Seat belts clicked open, overhead bins groaned under the weight of restless hands, and the soft chatter of disembarking filled the space. Elijah remained seated, watching as the other passengers gathered their things, moving with the ease of those who had never questioned their place in the world. The young man in the hoodie caught his eye, offering a faint nod of acknowledgement. Elijah returned it, recognizing in him the quiet understanding of those who had learned to navigate the world carefully, always aware of how easily the ground could shift beneath their feet. By the time Elijah stepped into the terminal, the city outside had fully awakened, its lights stretching endlessly into the horizon. He walked slowly, his reflection catching in the glass as he passed. A man in a dark coat. A black doctor. A traveler among strangers. But Elijah knew no matter how far he flew, he carried the weight of the sky with him. And tonight, that weight felt just a little lighter.